Our parable this evening is in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. It says this: He told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you've prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" It's good to be with you on Father's Day weekend. We're grateful for all the fathers who are here. It's a privilege for those of us who are fathers to be fathers, and we love that role that we play. But there's kind of an inside joke at the church, our church, but I think churches generally, how we treat Mother's Day and Father's Day a little bit differently. You might already know what I'm talking about here, but on Mother's Day, the weekend goes like this. Everyone gets all dressed up because mom wants to go to church, and so everyone's going to go to church with mom, and we're going to go out to a nice lunch afterwards, so we have to look really good and make mom happy. And then you come to church, and everything about that service is rightfully so, us saying things like this: "Moms, you are the most important people in the world. We couldn't do life without you. We love you so much. Our life would be nothing without you. You're the best. Your job is hard, and we know it, but you do it with so much grace," and I'm getting emotional just talking about it. That's what the Mother's Day service is like. We probably give you a flower or a bag as you leave, and we just love our moms. Mother's Day is incredible. Then comes June, and a few weeks later, we have Father's Day weekend. We sandwich it in the middle of 2 beach retreats, so the kids are too tired to even pay any attention to dad at all. The dads drag themselves here to church, and then the preacher gets up and says, "Men, we need to do better. You need to get your stuff in order. You need to get rid of all your secret sins, and you need to be nicer to your wife." It's just very different how we treat these two things. And guys, I just want you to know, I've got your back. Here's the thing. I'm so grateful for you and the role that fathers play in the home and in society and in the church. Dads are extremely important. Now, based on the parable that is our passage for tonight, though, I really only have one thing to say. Guys, we need to step it up. We need to do things better. We need to get stuff fixed. This is a warning parable that Jesus gives, and it applies to everyone, men, women, everyone in every stage of life. But as in studying it and preparing for it this week, I really do have a lot of the men in this room in mind when we read this parable. I think some of the dangers of this particular parable are the most acute for those of us who are men. So, with that in mind, it makes me think of something. I've been ruminating on it this week and thinking about it. There was a Vine that came out about 10 years ago. And just so you know, I'm going to give you some education here if you don't already know. Vine was a precursor to what is now TikTok. So TikTok has these little short-form videos where people do things. Vines were what were cool when I was finishing college and seminary. And so there are these little 6-second videos. And there was one of those videos that kept traction over time. That I found it this week, and I thought it was hilarious. It was a football coach, and he was, at the time, the head football coach at Boston College. I have a picture of the Vine. I'm not going to play it for you. I'm just going to tell you what he says. He's standing over his team as they're practicing, and I guess it's a recruiting video or something, and he says this. I want to make sure I quote him correctly. He says, "What could be better than this? Guys being dudes." That's what he says. And I think that's a pretty helpful little phrase to explain sometimes the way that men behave, either alone or with other groups of people. Sometimes guys are just being dudes. Sometimes we do things that are different than women would do them, and it might seem strange, but it's undeniable that it's awesome. I'll give you an example of this. I was not at the beach this last week with our students, but in previous years, high school beach retreat was the retreat I went to. This year I'm going to junior high, but the last couple of years, my job at high school beach retreat was that I did beach safety for the Cypress campus. So that means the kids who are going to get into the water on the beach, I was the one responsible for monitoring who was going in and not letting people get in. And so just in case you're ever wondering how beach retreat works, we make every kid who gets in the water go to their campus group, and they have to have a buddy when they go in. So they turn in their name tags, they get in the water with the buddy, And once they're in there, occasionally the person who's in charge, which was me, I would blow a horn, and every kid has to grab the hand of their buddy and raise it in the air to show that they're there. Now, if there's a bunch of kids in the water and I can't count them immediately, I will make them get out of the water, and then once they get out, we count them again. And then occasionally, you come across a kid who doesn't have a buddy, and we say, "Where's your buddy?" And he goes, "I don't know." And I go, "Well, we're never going to Beach Street again. This whole thing's gone." Anyway, it's terrifying. I hate the job. It's not something that I'm good at, and I'm glad I'm not doing it this year. Now, I say all that because last year, there was some bad weather on a couple of the days and a strong current to where we were not letting kids get in the water at all. So because of that, I was able to see some things on the actual beach, not in the water, because I wasn't freaking out about the kids in the water at the time. And one of the things that happened on one of the days cracked me up. It was a kid from the Cypress campus. He found a children's shovel that was left on the beach. And so he did what you do with a shovel, is he started digging a hole. So he got the shovel and he started digging. And after a little while, he kept at it for about 20 minutes. He kept digging. It got bigger. It got wider. And another kid came in and joined him, found a shovel, and then they started digging together. So over the course of the day, these two kids, for the entire 3.5 hours, were digging a hole. That's all they did for the entire time. And so they dug it. It got wider. As the hole gets bigger, they had to start making some strategic decisions about where the hole was going to expand, how deep it was going to be, what the kind of sediment that they were working with was. I mean, they were full-on engineers talking about this stuff. And what was hilarious to me about this during the day is that as they made their plans and they were digging this hole, I was watching the reaction of other students and adults who would walk by these two kids. This became a sizable hole as the day went on. And so the girls, when they would walk by, they would double take and look at the hole, and they would go, "What are they doing?" And then they would walk off. Almost every time, that's what would happen. When any guy would walk by the hole, this could be another student, it could be an adult, it could be a kid that was not related with our group, they would see the hole, and almost every time, here's what they would do. They would stop, they would walk up to the hole, and they would say something like this: "That's a nice hole you've dug there." And then they would start asking questions about the hole. "Why did you do it this way?" "Well, did you know if you actually go for this kind of sediment, every guy who came up to that hole suddenly became a geological expert who knew how to dig out the foundation of a skyscraper. It's just guys being dudes. That's the way that guys behave." And there's a whole litany of things that you can explain guys being dudes. I came across something really funny this week. It was a Reddit thread. Reddit is a website where sometimes people will ask questions and people will answer. And a lady put a paragraph in Reddit, and she said, "My husband and my son and I went to the park, and my son found a stick. And my husband and my son could not stop talking the entire time we were there about what a good stick this was. And then when it was time to leave, they distracted me with our dog, and then they snuck the stick into the car and brought it home. What is the deal with sticks?" And she asked, "Men, is it weird that it's like this? What is the deal with sticks?" And the immediate response in the thread was people said, "Show us a picture of the stick." And so she did. She showed a picture, and it's just a stick. And then every comment underneath was like, "That is a good stick. That's right." That's one of those things that I think the men in this room know exactly what I'm talking about. That's a good stick. You might want to hold on to that one for safekeeping. You could do stuff with that in the future. And the women are like, "What is going on?" Now, guys being dudes, there are certain things about the way that men are wired that sometimes will lead us to do things that seem strange. We will focus on digging a hole for a really long period of time. We'll be fascinated by the hole, fascinated by a stick. Sometimes you see this play out when you watch children play. Now, I'm painting with pretty broad strokes here. This is not true of every single boy or every single girl, but I think this is generally pretty true. When you watch little girls play, typically what they do is they play people-oriented games. We're going to take care of the baby, we're going to feed the baby, we're going to play that we're going to the hospital, we're going to play that we're going to the supermarket and buying things from people. And boys, when they play, will often do things like, "I'm going to build the tallest tower I could possibly build, and then I'm going to tear it down." Or "I'm going to build an insane racetrack covered in an immaculately constructed blanket fort, and then I'm going to tear it down." A lot of times girls focus on people where boys will play with stuff. And part of that comes down to the way that largely men were wired and the job that God gave to men from the beginning of creation. In Genesis chapter 1, God places Adam in the garden and then gives him a job. He says, "You're going to cultivate this garden and you're going to name all the animals and take care of them." Now, there's nothing that I could think of more about guys being dudes than a person looking at the trees and naming the animals all day long. It's part of how we are wired and constructed. Now, all that being said, this parable gives us a warning about what happens when guys decide that they're going to be dudes, but it not being attached to God's actual purpose for them. One of the things that we have to know about this is that men, and this is humans generally, but men are created for purpose. That drive that God has given us to focus on things and work hard on things and make plans and try and powerfully enact them, that comes from the fact that God has made us with a purpose in mind. And when we divorce our inclinations of doing the stuff that we want to do from God's purpose, it eventually leads to emptiness. So my big idea for this sermon, it's the one thing that I would want us to be able to walk away from, the one phrase to remember, it's this: big barns, no purpose. This parable tells us about a person who constructed big barns but had no purpose behind it. And when that happens, we miss God's call in our lives. Before we talk a little bit more about the parable, I do want to circle back and see what the context of the parable itself was. So, like many of Jesus' parables, this did not happen in a vacuum. He had been speaking to a crowd of people, and actually earlier in the chapter, he'd been saying, don't worry about what you're going to wear or what you're going to eat or drink, because God will take care of you. And then a guy blurts out in the middle of Jesus talking and says this. This is verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he, this is Jesus, said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?" He then said to him, "Beware, be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." So the thing that led Jesus to tell this parable is he was just telling them, don't worry about the stuff of your life. And then this guy interjects with his agenda, which is, God, tell my brother to share his stuff with me. Now, I will say, as a younger brother, I relate to this sentiment that this guy brings up. But keep in mind, in the ancient world, when there was an inheritance given, usually it would be in the form of land or livestock and things like that. It would not have been easy to divide. It wouldn't have been like cash. And so, for whatever reason, this guy has a grievance with his brother, and Jesus tells him that, he says, man, I'm not here to be a judge or an arbiter between you. Now, I will say, this side note, a little bit different than the entirety of what we're talking about tonight. This is one instance where Jesus was distinguishing himself from Moses. Now, people were looking for a Messiah that would be a lawgiver like Moses, and a lot of what Moses did is he would judge disputes between the people. If you read back in that part of the scriptures, Jesus says, I'm not here to just arbitrate disputes between you. I'm here for something different. And so then Jesus gets under the surface of this guy's life and gives him a warning about what's going on. He says, be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. So he tells them the warning label for this parable is be on your guard, be watchful for every single form of greed. Now, that phrase I think is pretty important here. He doesn't just say greed, he says every form of greed. So one of the things that we're going to do in a moment is we're going to look at some of the forms of greed that we might be susceptible to falling into that could make us do what the guy in the parable did, which was to build giant barns, but to not have real purpose behind it. So every form of greed. I do want to make a note of something. When you look back at the response of the man in the parable, so it tells us that the land of the man was very productive. That's the way that this parable starts. He has so much stuff from his land that he has to figure out something to do with it. And we find out right away that this guy has what I've heard someone call a pronoun problem. Look at how he talks about this. This is verse 17. He began reasoning to himself, so he's thinking in his own mind, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store up all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. You might notice this guy was a little bit self-centered. I, me, my. I've heard someone call it this before, the I, me, my monster. If you've ever met a person that every conversation that you ever have with them, it doesn't matter what you're talking about, it's going to circle back to I, me, my. And by the way, we're all guilty of that at some time or another. But we notice that that's what's happening with this guy. I, me, my. I also would point out something in the text, that the guy did not get this great yield of crop because of his own work. The text says it clearly, the land was productive. It's not that he was smart and got a bunch of stuff. The land gave it to him, and then he took credit for it. And here's what we find out about the guy. He was greedy. He was greedy. He says he wants to build bigger barns to hold all his stuff, and then his goal is to eat, drink, and be merry. And here's a few things that I think are worth talking about in this parable. First one is this: possessions without godly purpose don't bring joy. Now, clearly, the most common form of greed that we might talk about is greed for stuff, possessions, money, cars, houses, boats, rare Pokemon cards. Whatever it is that you're greedy for, stuff. That's the most normal way that we would think about it. We want all this stuff. But the truth, and I think when we look at human history, it's pretty clear. People who amass a great deal of wealth and possessions, those things by themselves, they do not bring joy. Now, I do want to make clear, though, that possessions, when used purposefully and used for a godly purpose, can bring joy to you and to other people. But the issue is when they are pursued in greed and pursued as their own end, they do not bring joy. John D. Rockefeller, one of the most famous people in history. He was, not the most famous, most wealthy people in history, and very famous. He created what became the Standard Oil Company, which most of the major oil companies now came from Standard Oil. And so he was, at the time, the wealthiest man in the world. And he was being interviewed at one point, and a journalist asked him, they said, "Mr. Rockefeller, you are unimaginably wealthy. You couldn't need any more money than you have. How much money would you say is enough?" And his response was this: "Just a little bit more." That is the nature of greed. That this quote is attributed to him, and it seems that it really did happen. And that is the nature of greed. It does not matter how much you get. It will never satisfy you in itself. Just a little more. If I just have a little more, then I'm going to feel good about it. And the truth is, it just doesn't work out that way. You could get all the money that you could imagine. You could buy your dream house that you wanted and have everything that's on your retirement wish list, and it's never going to satisfy you. You're just going to want a little bit more all the time. Solomon says it this way in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep." Solomon says that when someone really amasses a great deal of wealth, often they become even more miserable than the person without money. Possessions in themselves will never make you satisfied, which I do think should make us consider how much of my time and energy am I spending toward building up possessions. Now, I do want to make clear from this parable, the things that the man in the parable does are not necessarily evil in and of themselves. There is not anything intrinsically wrong with him building larger barns to store his stuff. The issue is the attitude behind it, that once I have this, then I can sit back and relax and I'll have everything I want. It's not true. Possessions will never make you happy, as illustrated even by the fact that the guy didn't get to enjoy his possessions. The time came, he built it all up, was ready to enjoy it, and then God says, your life is being taken tonight. Now who's going to enjoy the things that you built up? So, possessions without godly purpose, they don't bring joy. I don't think that takes a lot of convincing. I think all of us have seen enough wealthy people who are extremely miserable to know that wealth is not the answer to make you joyful. The second one is this: planning without godly purpose does not bring true success. Now, the guy in this parable had a plan. He thought clearly through what he wanted to do. He had a strategy. He went and he executed it and he succeeded, but it didn't bring eternal or real success. He died before he even got to see the fruit of that success. The passage that comes in the Old Testament, it says, a man plans what he's going to do, but the Lord directs his steps. It's Proverbs 16:9. The mind of a man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. There are some of us who I think make an idol of control, feeling like you can be in control of the situation and what's going on with you and in your life and in your family and your work. Making plans and following through on it is a good thing. I think that's part of what it means to be made in God's image. God planned and then created, and he said it was good. We're meant to do the same. But if what we're doing is trying to seek fulfillment through control, it's never going to work. It won't work. Ultimately, God's plans are what are going to happen in and around your life. And if you are seeking after control as an idol, it's never going to lead you to true success. And again, there are many, many examples that we can talk about of people who made a plan, executed it, and it went according to plan, but it didn't actually lead them to a successful life. The last one is this, and I think it encapsulates the first two. Power without godly purpose doesn't bring fulfillment. So we talked a little bit ago about the fact that every form of greed is what Jesus was warning about. The first level of greed is stuff, money, possessions, things. The second level of greed would be control. I'm going to have control over the situation and make things happen. And I think the thing that encapsulates both of them is power. Often, what people are greedy for is power. Certainly, you've seen this in your life and in relationships in different places that you've witnessed. There are people that are greedy and hungry for power. Maybe in your work you've seen it. Maybe you've seen a politician or two in your life who was greedy and wanting to have power. And all different areas. People become greedy for this, but the truth is that it doesn't lead to fulfillment. I read an autobiography about 10 years ago, and I came across it by accident. It was in someone else's library, and I picked up the book, and I didn't know anything about this person, but I read it and was interested. And the person I read about was a guy named Jack Welch. And so Jack Welch, if you're not familiar, was the CEO of General Electric in the 80s and the 90s. And he was extremely successful as a CEO. At the time, General Electric was maybe the most important company in the world. Now it's kind of become a joke. It's really dwindled off in the last 20 years. But when Jack Welch was the CEO, he was running and gunning, wheeling and dealing, one of the most powerful and influential people in the world. The company was successful. People listened to him. Politicians and world leaders listened to him. He had a great deal of influence. And so I read this book where he tells the story of his life and how he worked his way up from being poor to being the CEO and how much he grinded to make it happen. And he talked about his philosophy on how you should run a company and how you manage people and how you get the best out of the people. And he clearly was a sharp person. He was extremely successful. And he had all of his philosophies about how business would work. He also talked, I will say, in the book a lot about how often he played golf. Like hundreds of times a year, he'd play golf. So it was all business, all golf, all the time. And I got near the end of the book, reading it, and it was interesting. I felt like I learned a lot. But I got to the end, and I thought, how did this guy have enough time in the day to do all the things that he was talking about? Jet setting all over the world, playing golf like 4 times a week, running this company. How did he have time to do it? And at the end of the book, I found out how he had time. The clear answer was that he completely neglected his family for his entire adult life. So he and his wife obviously got divorced. That it would be an unbearable person to live with that was never there and was obsessed with his own power and influence and his own golf more than his own family. And so his first wife he divorced, and that by the time I read this book, he was on his second wife. And then I picked up another book from him specifically about management strategy that was written a couple years later. And by that time, he was on his third wife and was writing the book with his third wife. And it became clear to me, if this guy is the pinnacle of what worldly success looks like and influence and power, I think it's pretty clear that in order to achieve that, or a lot of times being greedy to achieve that, makes the most important parts of your life a complete failure, which is what happened with him. He was greedy for power and was a complete failure as a husband and as a father and as a family man. And I think there are hundreds, thousands of examples of men throughout human history who have shown this to be true. The greed for possessions, the greed for control, the greed for power is empty. Empty. And even if you accomplish the things that you're looking for, what you're going to find is God's going to say, your life is required of you now. Are you even going to enjoy the fruits of what you've done? And the answer is no. The answer is obviously no. I want to look back at the way that the bad example person in this parable talks about what he wants his future to be. This is in verse 19. I will say to my soul, meaning my inner person, the essence of who I am, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So he's saying, I have all the stuff that I was greedy for, so now my life can be good. My soul can be at ease. But then God says to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you've prepared? And so is the man, and this is the warning for us, who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. I think the lesson from this is extremely clear. God has made men and women uniquely in the way that he's created us. And men, a lot of us have an innate drive in us to accomplish things with our life, to pursue things that are interesting to us and important. And a lot of times that shows itself in work. It might show itself in investing. It might show itself in a hobby. But the thing that we must remember is that those things have to be coupled with being rich toward God, meaning knowing him and walking with him on an intimate level, having the passions of our life directed toward godly purposes. When you live that way, then you can enjoy the things that God has placed in your heart, and it's not empty. There's nothing wrong with building big barns if it's for a godly purpose. But I wonder how many of us look like this. We're just digging a hole like those two kids on the beach for 3 hours, only for it to be, just be washed away by the tide a little bit later. That's only worth doing if godly purpose is behind what we're doing. I want to read a little bit more from Solomon, who we read from earlier, of what he says a life of work and goodness looks like. Verse 18, here's what I've seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself. This looks a little bit like the guy in the parable. In all one's labor in which he toils under the sun, during the few years of his life which God has given him, for this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. I want you to notice there are a lot of similarities between what the guy in the parable was trying to do and then what Solomon actually says. The difference, though, is that Solomon says we should view the blessings that God gives us in life, whether it's our labor or whether it's the things that we earn, we view them as a gift while they're here in the days that God has given us, but they are not the ultimate thing that make us happy or fulfilled. It has to be coupled with that knowledge that it comes from the Lord, coupled with the passion to walk with the Lord. When that happens, men, and particularly men here, the desires that God has placed in your heart and the dreams that he's placed of things that you could accomplish and do, those things are good. He's placed them in there for a purpose, but it has to be done in tandem with what God is calling you to do in your life. Otherwise, you're just building a giant barn for no reason. I want all of us to know, and for the men in the room and the dads here, we appreciate everything that you do. Your role is, it's so important that it can't be overstated in your family. And I just want you to remember that for all the other things that you might be pursuing in your life, whether it's your career or whether it's wealth or whether it's social status or anything else, all those things are secondary or even third to the real responsibilities that God has placed in your life, which is one, to know him and walk with him, and two, to take care of the greatest responsibility that he's given you, which is your children and your spouse. God has placed those things in your life for a reason. And if you do those things, you stay focused on the main things, all the other things you do will be a success. They will bring you joy. They will bring you fulfillment. But if you pursue those other things in and of themselves, you'll be just like Jack Welch, someone who might achieve a level of success, but the rest of your life is a wreck. We don't want our lives to be a wreck. We want our lives to be exactly what God has made us to do. And so the question that I have for you at the end of this then is, what kind of barns are you building?